A few weeks ago on the channel, I was testing a very cool application called CPU Set Setter. This free application allows you to do very cool things like, yes, increase the frame rate in games, but also, for example, have a video exporting on your second CCD while you're gaming and not really suffer too much a performance penalty. But as you probably gathered, almost all of that testing does indeed revolve around a Ryzen CPU which has two CCDs. And that was the comments in the last video. A lot of people really enjoyed the video and I'm very thankful for the feedback, but I did get a lot of questions asking how this can benefit you if you only have a processor which has a single CCD, such as the 9800 X3D. As you probably gathered, that's precisely what we're going to be testing here, and to answer your question up front, does it get you as much of a performance benefit? No, but there are some tangible cool things you can do, and yes, there are some performance gains utilizing this application. For this CPU, I'm using a Ryzen 9 9950 X3D, but I disabled the second CCD. This will almost totally mirror how a single CCD CPU would behave. In this particular case, it would be a 9800 X3D. How did I do this and why? I don't own a 9800 X3D or a single CCD Ryzen processor, at least a modern one. I have like Zen 2, but it's a little old perhaps for this particular testing. So what I've used is Ryzen Master to disable the second CCD. So in essence, CCD is 0 is the only one which is addressable to the Windows operating system as well as games. So in a sense, we have 8 cores, 16 threads only, so it will behave basically the same way as a 9800 X3D will. Before we get into the single CCD stuff though, I did also want to give you guys a quick additional piece of bonus content, and this is actually with Call of Duty Black Ops 7. I was kind of curious how, since the game is kind of a Microsoft title, I mean it's Activision, I was wondering just what type of performance we would get if we was to use CPU Set Setter with the 9950 X3D. And so we're going to get into that, and then we're going to get into the new stuff for the single CCD variant. As for the rest of the setup, there's an Asus Astral RTX 1590 and Windows 11, with the drivers and operating system updated to the latest version. Well, actually, technically these results were from around a week ago and I'm just getting around to editing, but I digress. Combine that with 48GB of gold, I mean RAM, and that's running at 7600 MTS. While I do want to focus primarily on a single CCD for this video, I also want to give you guys a kind of follow-up for the 9950 X3D and what CPU Set Setter could do for Call of Duty Black Ops. Now, obviously, as you can see here, the work currently is being split up across both of the CCDs. So you can see that, for example, for some reason or another, the second CCD, CCD1, is getting a lot of work right now. And I'll show you the options. Now, I really want to stress I am not a Call of Duty guy. So the options I'm using are basically to ensure, I'm using the wrong mouse, that's very helpful. The options I'm using are basically to ensure that the GPU is not being the limiting factor as much as possible. So I'm going to look under graphics, and unfortunately with this, just with how Call of Duty works, for some reason I can't get the task manager working on that screen unless I take away exclusive full screen, and then that brings up some other problems. So we're just going to have to kind of do a mixture of capture using a capture card and my phone, unfortunately. But, you know, we'll do our best. Anyway, under the quality options, basically, I've chosen the basic preset, and DLSS is set to ultra performance. Now, obviously, this is going to look terrible. But again, this is just to hammer the CPU as much as possible and take as much load off of the GPU as possible. Again, if you look here at the load, it's really being kind of distributed very evenly across all of the various CPU cores, and interestingly, CPU 9 often gets hit really heavily, like 90% usage, 70% usage, and you can see that this is pretty prolific across all of the cores. So for example, obviously because this CPU has SMT, so CPU 15 would be both threads on that core. I think that's pretty obvious, but I'll just mention it anyway. You see that we're averaging 400 FPS, 300 FPS, depending on the scene. And I'm going to do my mouse. And here we're getting an average of 447. Notice the bottleneck for this for the GPU and the CPU. Funnily enough, 50% even. So literally half the time it's CPU bottlenecked and the rest of the time it's GPU bottlenecked. Now we're going to switch to only a single X3D CCD, and despite this, some of the work is still being pushed on to, this CPU core 9, but it's favoring the CCD 0 a lot more than previously. Right there you can see it's like 580 FPS. And if we look at the bottleneck here for the GPU, I don't even have to remove the overlay. You can immediately see the difference. So let's look at the benchmarks for Call of Duty Black Ops 7 using CPU set setter for the Ryzen 9 9950 X3D. Default behavior, in other words, if you weren't running the application, CCD 0, where the Vcache is the one being assigned to do all of the work. Again, for some reason, on CPU core 9, which of course is on the second CCD, you can see that work does spike, but we're still seeing a big improvement, over 100 FPS for CPU on average FPS, and the general average is around 10% better. More importantly, the low FPS numbers have also increased significantly too. Also for fun, I ran the benchmark with the vanilla CCD only being set, CCD1 as a comparison. So with our 9800 X3D, we have 8 physical cores, pick 16 logical processors. So when you're using CPU set setter, it will basically address these as CPU 0 to 15, so that's 16 total of course. Now in my previous video, I did cover how to set up CPU set setter, how you can create custom configurations and a whole bunch of other stuff. If you have a dual CCD processor, for example, the 7950 or the 9950 X3D or something like that, it will basically create 2 configurations for you. But for a single CCD variant, or if you want to create custom ones, you will have to do that manually. So again, I've gone over that much more extensively in the previous video. If you want to check that out to kind of get a better insight into how all of that works, you can feel free. So I don't want to go over the same ground exactly in this video. Welcome to Spider-Man 2. For CPU set setter on our single CCD configuration, which again is aping a 9800 X3D, I've created several different profiles. I thought it would be interesting, since each CCD sports 8 cores, 16 threads, to create different profiles to test out different aspects of this. The application sees all of these threads as CPU 0 to 15. In essence, if you leave it unset or with all of the threads selected, it would be like having the application not running. But then what on earth is 0 to 7, 8 to 15, and what's the difference between it and even and uneven for those profiles I've created? Well, hopefully this diagram helps a little bit. In short, 0 to 7 would be the first 4 physical cores on the CCD, and 2 threads for each of those cores, so there's 8 threads of course total. As you probably guessed, 8 to 15 are the remaining 4 physical cores, along with their respective threads. And even and uneven, well, what's that? Well, as we've just established, since each core can juggle 2 threads, here I'm selecting even threads. So this means that each of the physical cores is now only loaded up with 1 thread for the game. Meanwhile, uneven would be the reverse. You would be telling thread B on that same physical core to run, but thread A wouldn't be doing anything. So for Spider-Man 2, we're going to stand right here and just kind of look at the frame rate as I'm trying different things out, and you can also get a better understanding of what's going on courtesy of the CPU graphs, which of course are on this monitor. So what I shall do is quickly run you through the graphics settings. Again, this is on an RTX 5090 Astral, and if I mosey on over to display, 1440p with frame generation disabled, that actually offloads some work from the CPU. Transformer model with ultra performance. As for graphics, very high. Ray tracing is set to high because it does again put a bit more work on the CPU. These ones are very CPU heavy. I was actually doing some testing recently in a video on basically how a 10900K and a 10600K kind of deal with games recently. And what I noticed is with ray tracing and other things, you know, it really does hammer, of course, you know, one of those processors. But you can do things like frame generation to help offload. That's with a 5060 Ti, if memory serves. So anyway, now at the moment, the CPU is behaving exactly as default. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to press on my keyboard 1. And here we can see this being assigned 0 to 7 on the CPU set setter, and the graphs are going to start updating. So what does this do? Well, if you can look at the in-game overlay, you'll see that basically CPU 1 to 4 now have a lot of work on them for both threads. So what this essentially is doing, and again, I'll use my mouse. Hopefully I can just kind of press the start key and show you. So we'll click on 0 to 7. And basically what this is doing, these two are basically the same, the two threads on the CPU core 0 is offloading all of the work to 4 physical cores and their SMT threads. Now, we can use this as another example. I'm going to press 3. Actually, let me just go back so we can see what this is doing in real time. And this is setting it to even. So now what's happening is Spider-Man 2 is running on 1 thread per core. So it's almost kind of like SMT being disabled for Zen 5 or whatever Zen processor you're using. However, you will also still see some work that's creeping up for the other thread. Why is that? Well, basically, it's not totally black and white. So CPU set setter does its best to push work onto only a set of threads that you assign, but at the end of the day, work can still spill over if it's necessary, for example, not to crash the game or for something mission critical. So sometimes if you were to like try to load the game with only like 1 or 2 threads available, that could cause some problems. So you kind of get the idea. This is actually really cool though. So there's some actually interesting things you could do here. For example, I've gone and made a few profiles here. And you can do that by basically just, and I did show this in another video, but you can basically just create your profile by typing whatever you want here, click add, and then select the number of cores or threads, and you can also assign a hotkey. Now I've created this one, which is lovingly called example, and even and uneven. So at the moment, I believe I'm set to, okay, I'm set to even. I'm just going to select that as uneven, and that's going to flip the threads. And I'll load up Cinebench here. It's going to take a second. Oh, never mind. It's already kind of giving me a preview of what I did earlier. I had an audio issue earlier, so I'm having to re-record this. I'm going to set this to 30 minutes test stability. And I'm going to press start. Now, what this, of course, is going to do is therefore just run Cinebench on a couple of the different threads available on the processor, and the rest are going to be, well, basically we now have 1 thread for each core that is being allocated specifically for Spider-Man, but on the other cores which are available and the other threads that are available, we have 2 of them that are being assigned to Cinebench, and the rest, well, basically speaking, they're relatively idle. However, you will still see on our task manager here that some of the cores still have some work spiking, so that may be anything from background tasks to maybe the game or Cinebench or what have you spilling over. So of course, at the end of the day, a Ryzen 9 9950 X3D or a dual CCD processor for Ryzen is still able to do a lot more in terms of flexibility. For example, in the previous video, I showed that you can have like Cinebench running and let's say, for example, Handbrake, while also be playing games. So you would assign the games, for example, to the Vcache CCD, and the other ones would be handling, you know, other workloads. But with this, you could still have, let's say, Adobe Premiere or Handbrake running on a couple of threads or a couple of cores and assign the rest to a game. And this could be really good if let's say you wanted to do some Blender work, if you're creative and you've got only like 8 processor cores, 16 threads, you could assign maybe a couple of the threads to, let's say, exporting something in the background for video or audio or whatever you're doing, whilst you could still be working, and that could be really cool. Again, Photoshop, there's some things you could do there. But if your game, if you're creating content on YouTube, for example, let's say you're a Let's Player and you have like a 9800 X3D or something like that, which is basically what we're simulating here, because our 9950 X3D using Ryzen master, I've disabled those, that second CCD. What you could do is have, let's say, Adobe Premiere or whatever application you're using to cut up and, edit your videos. You could have maybe several videos that are queued up to be exporting in the background, assign just a couple of threads, a couple of cores to that, and then the rest could be for gaming. And yes, it will potentially affect your frame rates, but you could also set a maximum FPS target in your game. For example, let's say you're uploading to YouTube. YouTube might go to 60 Hz only or what have you. And if you're playing like a single player game, yeah, higher frame rates, it would be nice, but you could probably get away with like capping your frame rate to like 60 FPS or 90 FPS or what have you. So it's still going to look really nice for YouTube, and it's going to effectively, kind of better use your system. Close Cinebench. So now we're back into Spider-Man 2, and we have basically this doing absolutely nothing. So if I click 0, so right now Spider-Man 2 is not being set. So we're getting around 170-ish FPS in this little marketplace. And if I press the 1 key, so okay, so it's slightly more here. There's more stuff with larger draw distance. So let's say 130 is a nice angle. Press the 1 key. So now, again, it's only on those 4 physical cores with their SMT threads. So it's dropped down to around 120, 121. So it's still pretty reasonable. Obviously, this is still pretty CPU bound. Press 2, and now it's on the other 4 physical cores. Around the same performance, actually slightly higher. Now, this I find quite interesting. Let's go to 3. 140, 141. So obviously, it's a higher performance because it's not dealing with, like, trying to run 2 threads on core. You have like the entire resources of that full core essentially, and then press the 4 key, and it's even slightly higher. So that's uneven. You can see it's actually almost as good, funnily enough. It's actually higher. Actually, I'll take that back. Never mind. For some reason, look at that. It's actually higher. So uneven. So running only 1 thread per core is actually a chunk higher. Now, in reality, it could not actually play out like this, because if a game, for example, is streaming in lots of assets in the background, minimums could be hit. But even so, there are some pretty cool things you can do with this, and we're going to take another look at another game in just a second, which is Counter-Strike 2. So at the moment, nothing's showing up. So far, Counter-Strike 2 is just running default. And you will notice the frame rate here is around 840, 830 FPS. Now check this out. Suddenly, we're getting 880, 890 FPS, which is a small improvement, and this is uneven. So what this is basically doing is putting one thread per physical core. Now notice this, I'm going to do the same thing again, but now we're only getting 840 because we've gone to uneven. So for some reason, uneven is actually performing slightly better, which I think is quite interesting. Again, this is the even set, or 834, 835, 880. Now, if I go back to default, we actually do lose a few frames per second. Just for the hell of it, let's go ahead and set that to 8 to 15. It's actually a small performance loss. We were 800, now at 770, 780. And this one, which is 0 to 7, 720. It's actually even greater performance loss. I don't really know what the reason is. Maybe someone could comment below. I could speculate. I don't have in-depth knowledge of Counter-Strike 2 or the engine or anything like that, because I don't play this competitively. I'm simply doing this to give you guys some ideas of what stuff you could experiment with CPU setter. Now, what I will also add to all of this, let's assume, for sake of argument, that this does end up being a net performance benefit, uneven. Well, again, you could have, say, let's say you were to be doing some streaming or maybe some capture or something else. You could certainly throw something else in the background here. I'm just very curious, actually. So let's hypothetically say, I'm just going to load back up Cinebench. I probably should have kept that open and just stopped it, but whatever. Yeah, come on, Cinebench. So we've got even. I'm going to go and just load up the multi-core here. And it's only 10 minutes, but that should be fine. And with Cinebench, my cat has decided to start trolling me as I'm recording, which is very helpful. I'm going to set that to even. Hello, Lucy. Yeah, I'll give you attention in just one moment, Kitty, I promise. See, my cat is terrorizing me. Ah! There we go. So we have lost some performance, but it's actually not too bad. We're still well over 700. In a second, we're going to get into some graphs. Aren't they fun? Well, I decided to spice things up a bit. And what I did is basically redo all the same benchmarks that I used in the previous video with the various new CPU set configurations using our 9800 X3D single CCD. But from the previous video, I included 2 sets of benchmarks. I couldn't include all of them. There were way too many. It would make the graphs absolutely ridiculous to read. But I did want to include a couple of them. The first would be the 9950 X3D to just do as it's kind of nature intended. So basically there's no threads assigned, and it would be just like if you kind of set the system up, from scratch and CPU setter wasn't running. And I also included the results of the CPU setter being selected for the X3D V-cache only. So without further ado, let's get into some results. Right guys, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. I'd like to thank you once again for everyone who has been subscribing to the channel, and also for those who did enjoy the previous videos. Honestly, they kind of blew up. For those who don't know, I run a larger YouTube channel, Red Gaming Tech, but I wanted to create this channel because I think the content can be a little bit different. This is going to be a lot more fun projects, a lot more tweaking, a lot more reviews and silly things. That I have some very crazy ideas actually I want to test out, but I just haven't been able to yet because of Black Friday and all the sales and stuff like that. Plus also just other bits and pieces. But in the future, I'm also trying to figure out this format. But obviously, this is YouTube, so you guys know what to do if you are enjoying this content. Subscribe, basically. But with that said, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to give my cat attention because she's deciding it's going to be a really good idea to start scratching things because she wants my attention. See you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.